All right. Thank you, Mike. Our next speaker is the Assistant Secretary at Department of Homeland Security for Cybersecurity and Communications, Jeanette Manfra. Jeanette serves as the National Protection and Programs Director at NPPD Assistant Secretary for the Office of Cybersecurity and Communications. She's Chief Cybersecurity Official for the Department of Homeland Security and supports its mission of strengthening the security and resilience of the nation's critical infrastructure. Prior to this position, Ms. Manfra served as Acting Deputy Undersecretary for Cybersecurity and Director for Strategy, Policy, and Plans for NPPD. And prior to that, Ms. Manfra served as Senior Counselor of Cybersecurity to the Secretary of Homeland Security and Director for Critical Infrastructure Cybersecurity at the National Cybersecurity Staff at the White House. At DHS, she held multiple positions in the Office of Cybersecurity Communications, including Advisor for the Assistant Secretary for Cybersecurity and Communications and Deputy Director, Office of Emergency Communications, during which time she led the department's efforts in establishing the nationwide public safety broadband network. Before joining DHS, Jeanette served in the U.S. Army as a communications specialist and military intelligence officer. Jeanette?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for coming. I'm gonna maybe walk around just a little bit, shake things up. So I wanted to, first of all, it's a little awkward. I don't know how other people feel looking at yourself the whole time you're speaking. So thanks for changing it. So I promise we didn't coordinate this, but a lot of what you just heard about is actually a lot of the same things that we're thinking about at the department and in the government. And so I wanted to talk to you a little bit about where we are and sort of where we're thinking about going over the next couple of years. But first of all, I wanted to address the evaluation form. If you can just circle the 5, that'd be awesome. We've got some DHS folks around with pens that can help you. Really appreciate Symantec's foresight in putting that out. But I do really appreciate, I know it's not always easy to get out of your day job and come here and spend a day or even just a couple of hours listening to a bunch of folks speak. So I want to take as much time here to provide some value for that time that you've taken away from the office. So my understanding is that there's actually a lot of government folks here. So I'm going to spend a little bit of time, more than I normally would, talking about our federal government work and what we're doing on the civilian government side. And I also just want to take a moment to thank all of you for doing the work you're doing. It is really hard to do this work in the government. I know it, you all know it. There's a lot of challenges. We have budget challenges. We have people challenges. We have innumerable challenges that we can all talk about over a beer sometime. But I know how hard it is to do this work in the federal government and to stay in the federal government, particularly when other people are enticing you away with what might look like higher pay and less stressful jobs. But I promise you that I believe working in the federal government in this mission is one of the most rewarding things that I've ever done in my life. And so again, I just want to thank you all for doing that. And for those of you who support us, I want to thank you for that as well. I think we're in a really exciting time right now. I love reading history, and one of the things that I've really been reading a lot about as people talk about, we're in the middle of the next revolution, the next industrial revolution, where we have all these things that we need to change. So I was like, well, let me read about how people handled the last industrial revolution. And it's very interesting how governments and societies really struggled with a lot of very similar questions. Is how do we both take advantage of this amazing new technology, but how do we ensure that we don't leave people behind? How do we ensure that we are safe when we are building this new technology? And how do we ensure that the right incentives are aligned between public health and safety and what industry is doing and how our governments are interested in capturing that innovation and that growth for the benefit of our society, but having to balance a lot of different things. It's very similar to what we're looking at now. And the other thing that I find really interesting is looking back on computing history. It just always fascinates me to read about the people that they didn't have all this stuff. They didn't have sort of human language code. They had to come up, just mathematicians and engineers tinkering around, trying to figure out, well, I want to solve this really complicated problem here. I want to build a bomb, or I want to predict the weather. How do we build these machines to do that? And one of the things, a statistic that I read in a book recently was talking about the Princeton Institute of Advanced Study that did a lot of work in early computing. And I was talking about these incredibly complex physics and meteorology problems that the scientists were running. And these machines would, churn night after they would, painstakingly take all their questions and reduce it down to, a machine language punch card level code. And they were talking about, they were trying to solve the problem of, is it possible to predict where artillery would land, and all the different things that had to go into predicting that, and that humans could do it, but it was too slow. And so they arrived at this solution, which really helped the World War II effort. And they're like, and they did it all with 5 kilobytes of storage, which you're just like, 5 kilobytes of storage, what is that? What does that even mean? And so I started sort of doing some expert Googling, and it was like, well, what does cyberspace look like now? And of course, it's really hard to estimate what that is, but the best estimates are that our digital universe, if you will, has a storage capacity of 10 to the 24th bytes, which is equal to 1,000 exabytes, which is 1 million exabytes, which equals 1 exabyte is a billion bytes. And so it's like, well, I wonder how much communication happens over the internet. And this one I have to look at my notes because I really didn't understand this one. So what some companies are estimating that global traffic is expected to hit 2 zettabytes a year. And for anybody who doesn't know, a zettabyte is 1,000 exabytes. So that's 1,000 times a billion bytes. I mean, that's amazing. And you think about, and this is what we're trying to defend. No wonder this is complicated. This is just an example, and again, that's probably not capturing everything, because that's sort of looking at what's indexed and then trying to estimate all of the rest. So no wonder this is complicated. No wonder we're struggling to figure out what are these complex solutions to these simple problems. And I think that it's important for people to recognize some of those things, because for those of us who are every day grinding away, trying to figure out how do I just increase my security here, how do I figure out who's connecting here so I can just prevent a breach so I don't get hauled up in front of Congress and everybody yells at me. But to take a step back and say, this is what we're trying to defend, it is almost unknowable. And again, that then puts us back in this position where previous generations have always struggled with, is we're on the cusp of becoming a digital society, if you will. And our country is, like a few others, I think we're perhaps a little bit further along than others. But we still have an enormous part of our country that I think has a ways to go. But so what does that mean? That means that, quote, cyberspace, which I don't love that word because I think it's just a stand-in for when people don't exactly know what they're talking about. But think about the space of computing and networks, and it runs everything now, and it increasingly will run everything more. And that's a great opportunity. It's driven incredible growth for our country and for many others, and I believe it will continue to drive great growth and opportunity across the world. And I don't want to lose that. But then how do we ensure that it's done in a way that we can ensure the safety of our electric grid, or the safety of our planes, or the safety of our voting processes? How do we ensure that we get both of those goals? And that's where I think the sort of the other revolution is, and that we in the government really need to take a leading role in, is changing the way that we think about who does what when we're thinking about security. And we're thinking about building networks and securing those networks. And what we've been really trying to push at DHS on the federal side is we're seeing a lot of opportunity in how agencies are taking the reality of their resource constraints, and they're saying, you know what, I need to outsource this. I need to adopt cloud solutions. And that's great from an efficiency perspective. But we need to ensure that we're doing it in a way that doesn't lead us down a path of losing visibility into what's happening on our networks. And I believe we can do that, but that requires very new ways of thinking about how DHS, how an agency, and how private sector works together to share data. And so we're really trying to challenge, okay, well, what does that actually mean? How can we continue to adopt better practices, more efficient practices, and importantly, as most of our bosses want, more efficient from a budget perspective? And so we've been spending a lot of time, you saw this in the president's executive order, thinking about what does it mean to have shared services? And what is the role of DHS in particular as we've looked at programs like the National Cyber Protection System with Einstein, which took one approach, thinking about the ISPs as that sort of natural consolidator and putting sensors there. And we're getting a lot of value from those sensors at the ISPs and then the sensors at the TICs. But the TIC is sort of the perfect example. We have this architecture, if you will, that requires people to funnel their traffic through these trusted internet connections or an MTIPS. But if you adopt a cloud solution, you actually have to do this sort of like wonky engineering to kind of then bring it back through the TIC and past those sensors. And you run the risk of negating some of those efficiency benefits that you got from the cloud. So looking at instances like that, where the government has put good solutions in place for what made sense over the past 10 years, but didn't accurately sort of capture, we didn't have perfect foresight, but thinking about, well, what if we had a different model of the government doing IT? And then you can expand that even broader, because one of the things that I say is, well, why did DHS choose this particular solution for federal cybersecurity? And the most common answer is, well, because we had to work with the architecture and the governance that exists currently in the federal government, which is generally very decentralized, federated, not top-down controlled at all. And so we're looking for ways is how do you sort of put solutions into that, we'll be nice and call it a very complicated way of doing business. So sort of the other initiative that is going to be critically important to improving federal government security is actually modernizing how we do IT. And to the extent that the government deals with OT, looking at that as well. And it's not just modernizing those legacy systems, although that is really a critical part of what we need to look at, because those are incredible vulnerability for us. We need to look at modernizing the whole thing. How do we think about governance of our IT systems? How do we think about procurement? How do we build systems where we can make risk-based procurement decisions, which we don't currently actually have a very good way of doing that. It's all based off of financial risk, not actual, what I would call mission risk. How do we think about how an executive, a mission owner, a principal cabinet secretary has the ability to have full insight into what's happening on their networks and what the risk that they're accepting for all of these very different decentralized procurements and activities that they're doing. And we're working that jointly with agencies, but I think there's tremendous opportunity, really building off our continuous diagnostics and mitigation program, to think about DHS as providing shared services that get us to a better, from a cost efficiency perspective. We're appropriated the money. We then work with the agencies to deploy tools in line with their requirements. But we also benefit because we're getting the sensor data back from those sensors that we're deploying. So then our NKIC is increasingly then in the position to being able to understand enterprise risk, and an agency head is able to understand what their risk is at the agency level. It's going to take us some time to get there, but we've made tremendous progress over the last couple of years, and I think what we're really trying to push more and more towards is where's the data? Where's the data that we depend upon? Where's the data that we need to protect? How do we get insight into that data? And sometimes that data, it may be run by a private company, which is fine, maybe in-house run by the government or some other sort of combination. And so how do we think about protecting that data in line with the sort of the framework in the cybersecurity framework? And so we're really trying to look at what are those other opportunities? How can we centralize more? Believe that really gets us some cost efficiencies. CDM alone, you can look at right now, we're estimating you're getting about a 70% reduction if you were just to buy those off Schedule 70 by using this kind of leveraging the purchasing power of the civilian government. But we're also getting standardized tools out. And I know there's been challenges as some of these have been deployed, and we've learned a lot of lessons, and we've put out a new contracting vehicle via Defend that I think captures a lot of those lessons learned. It also enables us to get into cloud and mobile with this solution. So that's sort of on the federal side. But the other thing that I really believe strongly about is DHS leaning into our authorities. Congress has really taken a lot of great action over the years to give DHS and federal government authorities more clarity around federal cybersecurity. It's not perfectly clear. There's still a bit of gray area, and there always will be. But, and I want to continue to work with Congress to get our name changed. As somebody mentioned, I think I was introduced as from NPPD, which is it's a terrible name. And I was told the story is that a couple of lawyers late at night needed to just get something back to Congress a few years ago, and they came up with the National Protection and Programs Directorate, which says nothing about what we are. So hopefully we'll get that moving along and become the Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency or something along those lines so that folks understand what we are. But that sort of aside, we now have tremendous authorities to deploy these capabilities. And we have the NCAIC now codified into law. And importantly, we have authorities to issue directives. And I think we've been very deliberate in how we think about these directives. And we actually work very closely with experts, both inside and outside the government, is how should we use this directive authority? And one of the things that we believe is really important is that it's not just that these directives are useful for agencies, but it is. And we do them in a way in collaboration so that agencies sort of all kind of come together and say, yeah, this is really something we could use help with. I'm really struggling to get the resources for this, for example, and kind of having our secretary issue that directive helps. But it also is, I believe, something that can signal to others that this is what we as a federal government believe is important. Others should consider similar activities. Now, I can't tell other people what to do. I don't want to tell other people what to do. I think we have, in critical infrastructure in the private sector, a lot of benefits have accrued from these voluntary partnerships that we have. But the federal government is a member of this cyber ecosystem just like everybody else. And so when we've got all the mail service providers, for example, doing DMARC, but not a lot of uptake on the enterprise side, you need to have both for DMARC to work. And so somebody in the private sector came to me and said, have you thought about doing something around DMARC? It's such a tangible, it's not completely simple, but it's not entirely complex either. It's a tangible way to where you could have broad, potentially international impacts by just a very simple solution that can deal with challenges around email security. That's a really great idea. And so we did it, and we published it, and we've been talking a lot about it. And now you're seeing not just the federal government increasing their email and their web security as a result of this directive, but you're seeing other industries take on the challenge as well. And so I think that's really important for us to consider because we as DHS and the federal government do have leverage. Again, it's not directive when we get outside of the federal government, but we do have leverage. And we can make statements and say, here's are the things, the security decisions that we're thinking about making. I encourage you all to have that conversation with your own industries as well. And so that gets to a little bit about, on the critical infrastructure side, what Mike was actually talking about earlier, is if you kind of think about this notion of this, it's the entire networked world that we live in is almost this unknowable expanse. How can we possibly defend it? One of the ways we're trying to think differently about it is not talking about a critical infrastructure entity or a specific asset within the federal government or a business as much, but thinking about critical services and functions. Because if you think about what the adversary is trying to do, they just see the network as a means to achieve some foreign policy goal. Which, at least the ones that we're concerned about. I'm separating criminals from this conversation. So if you think about it, everybody's kind of doing the same thing that they've been doing for hundreds, perhaps thousands of years. We're spying on each other. We're trying to prepare for the eventuality of some conflict or some escalation of tensions. People may be stealing different things from each other for various different purposes. It's all the same stuff. It's just happening in a new world, in a new medium that is incredibly challenging to figure out what's going on because of the signal and the noise problem, right? And so we want to go back and take a step back and say, what are those critical services and functions that our citizens and our residents depend upon? We care about access to clean water. We care about your ability to vote. We care about the stability of our financial system. And thinking about those things at that level. And when you start to break it down, and when you work with industry, you start to get a sense of we'll say a lack of a complete picture on how those services and functions are actually delivered these days, particularly for those very highly networked industries, and as well as for the government. I would put us in that same space. And so thinking about, okay, what is it that we all depend upon, that we have to have as a society? And you can assure yourself that the adversary probably has similar insight into those activities. And so they're probably thinking about ways to try to disrupt those, either through cyber or physical or some sort of likely more combined means. Now of course, there's broader geopolitical context to consider in all of this. But for us, that really changes who both the potential weak points are, because you're not thinking them, because they don't fit a definition of critical infrastructure, if you will, or there could be a tremendous partner because they're upstream a little bit, say a service provider to a financial institution, and they might have tremendous insight into what's going on. And if we develop closer partnerships and have information creation and sharing relationships with those entities, maybe we can start to stop things and see things before they actually get into those end asset systems that we're most concerned about. So on the critical infrastructure side, we're continuing to work with all of the traditional critical infrastructure owners and operators, but we also, again, we need to think about them as an ecosystem. There's a lot of people that are involved in ensuring the stability of our financial system. And so how do we identify who those companies are and who fits where in that value chain? And a year ago, it was a hypothesis. Now it's been proven that it can be done. But can you boil that critical service and function all the way down to indicators and warnings? And to where then we have all of those systems that we're trying to automate, all that data that we're trying to get access to, the analytics laying on top of it, that know what to look for because they're informed by a business or a mission understanding of what is critical to that organization. Then the other thing that I think is also fascinating to look for is while you're kind of doing that top-down, thinking about that critical service and function, that business, how does it boil down into indicators and warnings that both the private sector and the government should be looking for? You can also, again, the more that you automate, the more that you're able to correlate and automate your sensors, you can actually have a network view of the world, if you will. And you can start to see things that you may not have thought to ask the question for. In talking to data scientists, say, the biggest value of having all of this data is it's showing you answers to questions that you never thought to ask. And so thinking about it, and of course protecting all the pieces in place to ensure, and there's a lot of capability to ensure the privacy and the protection of that data that we and others have in place, but creating this kind of integrated sensor network. And of course, we're most focused on the federal government, but as more and more companies share their outputs of what they're understanding that's aligned with this understanding of critical services and functions, there's other things that you're starting to notice. And you start to see, why is everybody sort of aggregated around this one particular system here? And you realize that that system has some part of, say, the social security number database generator, that if you had done it just from that top-down approach, you actually wouldn't have identified that. But looking at it from what the data is showing, you're seeing that for some reason, a lot of people are using this database over here that is feeding into this other critical database over here, so we should do some more work to protecting that. So that, to me, is sort of the future on the policy side, and when we talk about information sharing, we're really trying to understand what are your critical functions, and what are those critical national functions, who's involved in delivering those, how can we, the government, understand what that is? Can we boil it down to indicators and warnings? Can we automate as much as possible those alerts off of those indicators and warnings? And again, not just automate the alert, but actually automate the action following the alert. And then how can we start to suss out, okay, there's a lot of things happening in this area that nobody was looking at, but we would have only understood that because of this kind of very tightly integrated sensing strategy, if you will. And so that, to me, is sort of the future of thinking about critical infrastructure and critical services and functions. And that gets to sort of this broader piece, which I talked about a little bit, is the ecosystem. There's a lot of things that I believe we in industry and international partners need to work together on to address some of the underlying insecurities of the actual internet and network infrastructure itself. And how do we work together in standards bodies and other places where we can take on some of these protocols were just not designed for security? So how do we maybe try to look at some of those areas? How do we think about where it might be useful, instead of putting a bunch of, spending a bunch of money, putting a bunch of sensors over here, or begging users to please patch their systems and to remember their 12-digit alphanumeric password, maybe there's some things in the underlying infrastructure that we could address to remove that dependence on the users and the asset owners. And so that's the third area we're really trying to push. And what are those ideas? But it really has to be government and industry working together. I can send people to standards bodies. I've been to some myself. For those of you who go, God bless you, they're very boring, but they're incredibly impactful. But I think that it's so important, though, to be able to engage, and to be able to engage on international standards, and to identify areas where us, industry, and again, our international partners can be looking as where are those opportunities to just not take the premise that, well, this is the way it's always worked, so this is the way we're going to continue to work it. I really think that there is an increased willingness to look at some of these things. A lot of these technologies and a lot of these protocols, it's not like they're hundreds of years old. They're just a couple of decades old in a couple of cases, but we sort of accept the premise, well, this is just the way transport works. So that's what we got to accept. And I don't think we should accept that. I think that we should really look, if we're going to change the future, if we're going to have that cyber moonshot, which some people have been talking about, we have to look at some of those big challenges. I wouldn't necessarily call them moonshots, but somebody called them roof shots, which I like better. But how can we take that on, and how can we take that on as a community? So with the few minutes I have left, I'm happy to take any questions. As long as it's not about taxes, because I don't understand taxes. I can't see very well, so. All right, so I blew you all away. 5s all around. Thank you.